She arrived at the wayhouse door in the gray teeth of a mountain storm, barefoot on frozen mud, and she was furious enough to set the rain on fire. Jeremiah Reed heard her before he saw her. He was crouched at the hearth of the salted stone wayhouse, feeding pine splits into the grate, and trying to ignore the way his left boot had developed a crack along the sole that let in cold water like a personal grievance, when the door came open with the force of someone who had stopped asking permission from doors a long time ago. Wind swept in and guttered every candle on the common room table. The old innkeeper, a woman named Bessa Cordron who ran the wayhouse like a battlefield surgeon ran a tent, spun around with her ladle raised. The figure standing in the doorway was tall, green-skinned, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that a cornered predator has before it decides whether the threat is worth the trouble. She wore a fitted traveler's bodice of dark-cured leather, laced tight up the front with rawhide cord, over a snug linen blouse the color of old cream. Her leggings were doeskin, close-cut and travel-worn, tucked into nothing because there was nothing to tuck them into. Her feet, large and strong and green and entirely bare, were caked to the ankle in the red clay mud of the Pilgrim Road. Her dark hair was plastered to her jaw. Her tusks were small by orc standards, just curving past her lower lip, and her eyes were the color of deep amber lit from behind by something angrier than firelight. She was, without any intention on her part, one of the most striking women Jeremiah had ever seen. He did not say so. He went back to feeding the fire. "I am Murak Wildheart," she said, and her voice had the low, controlled resonance of someone who had trained themselves not to shout when they very much wanted to. "I am looking for the man called Aldrich Bone." Bessa put her ladle down on the bar. "Not here. He was here. His horse is still in your stable. His horse might be. He is not." Murak stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind her, which was more courtesy than Jeremiah had expected after that entrance. She scanned the room. There were 4 other travelers besides Jeremiah. A pair of wool merchants playing knucklebones in the corner. A pilgrim woman wrapped head to toe in traveling gray who had not spoken since she arrived 2 days ago, and a young man sleeping with his face on the table and his ale still untouched in front of him. None of them were Aldrich Bone, who was the sub-collector for Governor Vane Harwick, who was the man bleeding every frontier township and way station on the Pilgrim Road dry with a tax that wasn't quite legal and couldn't quite be refused. Jeremiah knew all of this because he had spent the last 3 weeks learning it, in the way a man learns things when he is trying to avoid them and finds they follow him anyway. He watched Murak's eyes move across the room with the systematic efficiency of someone who tracked living things for a living. Her gaze landed on him last, held for a second and moved on. He was not what she was looking for. He was, he supposed, easy to overlook. 31 years old, medium height, the kind of lean that comes from eating only when there's time, wearing a trapper's canvas coat that had been mended in 4 different places with 4 different colors of thread. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed a razor and a face that people forgot in crowds. He was precisely the sort of man that powerful, furious women looked past, which, at this particular moment, suited him exactly. Murak walked to the bar, leaving small prints of mud with every step, and leaned both forearms on the wood. Where did he go? Bessa kept her face neutral. Guest business is guest business. Collected tax from my clan's route markers 3 times in 1 season and called it 3 separate road tolls. He has a written ledger that says we paid once. That ledger is going to a magistrate in Thornwall, and I am going to be the one who carries it there, and the ledger is in his saddlebag, which is in that stable. She held up a folded piece of paper. I have a legal writ from Clan Wildheart authorizing recovery of fraudulently collected civic records. You can read it or I can read it to you. Bessa looked at the paper, looked at Murak and said nothing. Jeremiah stood up from the hearth, not because he intended to get involved, purely, he told himself, because his knees were stiff. He rode south, he said, about an hour before the storm hit, on a gray horse with a cut left rear fetlock. He'll have stopped at the Miller's Fork shelter because he won't want to ruin the horse in the rain. That's about 4 miles. Murak turned and looked at him properly for the first time. You know him. I know his horse. I'm a trapper. I notice things. He paused. Also, he tried to collect a wilderness use tax from me last week for running a trap line I've been running for 6 years. I may have told him something impolite. Something shifted at the corner of Murak's mouth. It was not quite a smile. He will be at this shelter in the rain. If the fetlock held. He's half a mile short of it on the side of the road. She turned back toward the door. Wait, Jeremiah said. She stopped. The tension in her shoulders said she was waiting only because he had done her a service, and she would honor that debt for exactly the next 10 seconds before she walked out into the rain anyway. Jeremiah crossed the room to the pack leaning against the wall beside the hearth. He crouched, opened the top flap, and pulled out a pair of boots, heavy-soled oiled leather with thick wool lining. He had bought them 2 weeks ago in Coldgate Market because his current pair was dying, but he hadn't switched them over yet. He set them on the floor in front of her without comment, without ceremony, without explaining himself. He just put them there and stepped back and went to look out the window at the rain. There was a silence behind him that had a texture to it. I'm not keeping them, Murak said. I'm not giving them to you. I'm lending them for the road. 4 miles of sharp stone and frozen mud in the dark is the kind of thing that costs a person something they don't get back. Another silence. They will not fit an orc. He turned around. He had, when he was looking at her feet, estimated them at roughly the same length as his own orcs ran longer in the arch and wider in the ball generally. But Murak Wildheart was not a standard reference for orc feet any more than Jeremiah Reed was a standard reference for anything. Try. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once, none of which he could fully read. Then she sat down on the nearest bench, picked up the right boot, and pulled it on. Then the left. She stood. She took 3 steps. She looked down. They fit, she said, as though she was reporting a fact she found mildly annoying. Road's better if you go around the shrine of the twin rams instead of straight through, Jeremiah said, going back to his pack. Fewer loose stones. I know the road. I know you do. I'm just talking. She turned and walked out into the storm, and the door closed behind her without slamming, which he thought might be the closest she came to a thank you. Bessa Cordron looked at Jeremiah with an expression that was equal parts judgment and curiosity. You're going to want those boots back. Probably. He sat down by the fire and rubbed the crack in his old boot with the heel of his hand. But not tonight. The Miller's Fork shelter was a stone-roofed alcove built into a roadside cliff face, large enough for 4 horses and the people who rode them, with an iron ring for tying and a small brazier that travelers were expected to leave wood in for the next person who came through cold. Murak had been on this road 14 times in the last 2 years, carrying trade goods and clan documents, and once a message so sensitive she had memorized it and swallowed the paper, and she knew every shelter on it the way she knew every tendon in her own body. She found Aldrich Bone's gray horse tied to the ring, 3-legged and miserable, and Bone himself inside the alcove burning a piece of wood that someone else had left, reading a small bound ledger by the light of a lantern hung from the iron hook in the stone ceiling. He was a thin man, 50-odd years, with a careful face that had learned to arrange itself into expressions of patient authority. He looked up when she stepped into the shelter, and his careful face did something more complicated. This is a way station shelter, he said, open to all road travelers. You have no cause to trouble me here. Murak held up the writ. Clan Wildheart duly registered at the Thornwall Civic Registry, authorization for recovery of fraudulently obtained civic collection records. That ledger. She nodded at the one in his hands. Page 12 onward, 3 entries. I want the pages or I want the whole ledger. Bone tucked the ledger behind him against the stone wall. You have no standing to take private property. It is not your private property. It is a civic tax record. It belongs to the road authority. She stepped further into the shelter. Rain hammered the stone roof. I am giving you the opportunity to cooperate. What happened next was quick and ugly and not entirely unexpected. Bone was thin, but the two men who stepped out of the dark at the back of the alcove were not. Bone had company. Hired company, she revised, seeing the mismatched arms on them, one with a short sword, one with a cudgel. Private road muscle, the kind a man like Bone employed not for actual fighting, but for the effect of the threat. Murak Wildheart had, over the course of her 28 years, been in enough situations involving hired muscle to have opinions about it. The first opinion was that hired muscle at this level, protecting a tax collector on a road run, was competent at exactly one thing: frightening people who were already half frightened. The second opinion was that it failed entirely when confronted by someone who was already furious. She put the writ in her inside pocket, rolled her shoulders, and let her hands hang loose. She was not going to describe what happened in detail afterward, because it was not a story she particularly wanted to tell. But she got the ledger. She walked back up the road in the borrowed boots, which held the ground better than she expected and kept the wet out entirely, and she reached the salted stone when the storm was still running full and the windows were lit gold against the black. She had, she realized, been running hot and hungry and without sleep for 2 days. She had ridden from her clan's mountain territory to Coldgate to get the writ, ridden south to Westmark to confirm the filing window, and then her horse had thrown a shoe outside Crossbell Ford, and she had left it at a stable there, and continued on foot because the ledger's evidence would be useless if she missed the Thornwall court sitting by even a day. She had, in her focus on the objective, not thought carefully enough about what 2 days of hard mountain road did to bare feet. She had been running on anger, which was a fuel she understood completely, and the anger was still there, but the feet were reminding her that they existed and had opinions. She stepped into the wayhouse and found Jeremiah Reed still by the hearth, asleep in the chair with his head tipped back and his old boots still on, and she stood for a moment and looked at him. He was not a remarkable-looking man. She had met warriors and merchants and clan elders who filled a doorway. This man barely filled his own coat, but he had looked at her feet in a storm and put boots on the floor without making a single thing of it, and that was not nothing. In her experience, humans who did nice things for orcs usually needed you to know that they had done a nice thing for an orc. This one had just done it and turned away, as if it were ordinary. She sat down on the bench across the fire from him and pulled the ledger out of her coat. She was still there when he woke up at dawn. He woke to find her sitting across the hearth, reading a civic ledger with the focused attention of someone who read legal documents the way other people read maps, and the borrowed boots on her feet. The fire had been fed during the night. The candles had been replaced with fresh ones. The ale she had apparently ordered from Bessa at some point sat half-finished beside her. He watched her for a moment. In the firelight, her skin had the deep green tone of old river jade, and the angles of her face were strong in the way that mountains were strong, not gentle, not soft, but built for duration. There was a cut along her left jaw that had not been there when she left. It was fresh and cleaned, which meant she had cleaned it herself at some point, and it was the kind of cut that came from something sharp moving fast. "You found him," Jeremiah said. "I found him." She did not look up. "The ledger has 4 times as many fraudulent entries as I expected. How many townships?" 11 on this stretch of the road alone. He has been doing this for 3 years. Governor Harwick takes the surplus personally. The ledger has a second notation column, very small, written in a shorthand I recognized because my clan uses similar notation for trade debts. It converts the excess to sums paid directly to a private account in Thornwall. Jeremiah sat up and rubbed his face. Outside, the storm had dropped to a drizzle. The pilgrims would start moving soon. "What's in Thornwall?" "The circuit court sits in 5 days. Magistrate Orvin Castle. He has a reputation for following written evidence where it leads. And Governor Harwick," she looked up then. Her eyes were steady on him, and there was a layer of calculation in them that he recognized because it was the same thing he did when he was figuring out whether a particular animal trail was fresh or old. She was deciding how much of this to say out loud to a man she had known for approximately 7 hours. "Harwick controls the provincial army. If this case reaches court, he will know before the morning of the first sitting. He will try to intercept the evidence. Meaning you. Meaning me. Jeremiah looked at the fire. He thought about his trap line, running empty on the upper ridge while he sat in this wayhouse. He thought about the tax demand from Bones' predecessor 2 years back that had cost him a full season's earnings. He thought about the Miller's Fork shelter and the cut on her jaw, and the way she had walked back in from the rain with the kind of contained, banked-down fury that was not anger anymore but purpose. "The road to Thornwall goes through Hatch's Pass," he said. "There's a ridge trail above it, runs about 4 miles longer but bypasses the 2 road checkpoints and comes out at the lower gate. I use it in season." She looked at him. "You are offering to guide me. I know that road better than anyone alive, probably. I run traps up that entire ridge, know every rock and cover point." He paused. "Also, Harwick's roadmen gave a friend of mine 30 lashes in the public square of Westmark last spring for road disruption, which meant his cart was in the way of Bones' collection wagon. My friend's name was Declan Marsh and he was 53 years old. He looked at her directly. "I have reasons." Murak held the ledger for a moment, then set it down on the bench beside her. "Your name is Jeremiah Reed." "Yes, I am Murak Wildheart." "I know, you announced it." The corner of her mouth did the thing again that was not quite a smile. "The Ridge Trail. How long to Thornwall by that route?" 4 days at a pace that doesn't kill us. 3.5 if the weather holds." She looked at the window. The drizzle was thinning. "We leave when I finish this." He reached for his pack. "I'll get us food from Bessa." They left at mid-morning, and the Pilgrim Road spread out below them in the cold, clear light of a mountain autumn like a story someone had told too many times. The same shrines at the same intervals, the same warding stones carved with the same prayers, the same ruts that had been there since Jeremiah's grandfather traveled it as a young man. But the ridge trail above was different. It was a trapper's route, not a road, and it moved through the landscape instead of over it, following the terrain's own logic. Rocks you used as handholds, not obstacles. Streams you crossed on specific stones that Jeremiah knew by sight. He watched Murak Wildheart take the trail and felt a small, private surprise. Most people he brought up the ridge, the few times he'd had cause to struggled within the first hour. The trail was not difficult for him because he had run it 400 times, but it was difficult. She moved through it with an ease that was different from his own but equally effective. Where he read the landscape as a series of memorized problems and memorized solutions, she seemed to read it fresh each time, adjusting to what was in front of her with an attention that was total and apparently effortless. She did not fall behind. She did not ask him to wait. By midday they were high enough that the Pilgrim Road was a thin brown line below them, and the world was all rock and wind-bent pine. They stopped at a spring he knew, and ate the bread and dried meat that Bessa had charged him too much for, and the wind came down the ridge with a cold, clean smell. "Tell me about the clan," Jeremiah said. It was not really a question, more of an invitation. Murak sat on a flat stone and tore bread with her hands. "Wildheart runs the Northern Road Circuit. Trade, goods transport, information carrying. We are not a war clan, have not been for 2 generations. My grandmother ended the last formal conflict with the human northern townships and established the route marking agreements. The agreements stipulate that we pay road toll at the same rate as human transport operations of equivalent load." She held up a piece of bread. "We are not a war clan, but we know what has been taken from us, and we intend to have it back through the correct mechanisms." "The correct mechanisms," Jeremiah repeated. "You walked through a storm barefoot to get a ledger." "I was also angry. I noticed." She looked at him sideways, and this time the corner of mouth thing became briefly, clearly a smile. "My horse threw a shoe. I know, I wasn't criticizing." "You gave me boots without criticizing. Seemed like the right order." She was quiet for a moment, turning the bread in her hands. The wind moved through the pines and made a sound like something thinking. "Where did you learn the ridge trail?" "Trapping, mostly. I took over the line from an old man named Porter Weld when I was 20. He ran it for 40 years. He showed me every rock on it over one summer and then died in the winter, which I have always thought was good timing on his part. He looked out over the valley below. I've been up here more days than down there probably over the last 10 years. Alone, mostly. He did not elaborate. It was the truth in a simple form, and he did not feel the need to dress it up or explain it. He had been alone on this mountain for a long time, and he had made something like peace with it. He had not made complete peace with it, but something like it. Murak looked at him with an expression that was different from the calculating assessment she had given him before, different and harder to define. "My clan does not understand why I do the legal work," she said. "They would prefer someone who shouts in council chambers or challenges collectors to physical contests. I am capable of both, but neither of those produces binding civic precedent. And you want precedent. I want what we are owed. Precedent lasts." She stood, brushing crumbs off the leather of her bodice. "It also tends to get people killed when it threatens someone who profits from its absence." Jeremiah got to his feet. "Let's keep moving." They made camp the first night in a rocky overhang he used in trapping season, wide enough for 2 bedrolls and a small fire with the smoke running out along the stone ceiling and dispersing before it rose. The overhang had a view down 2 valley approaches, which he had chosen originally for practical reasons, and which now struck him as additionally useful. He had a trapper's habit of building the fire small and the bedrolls to either side of it rather than beyond it, which he'd never had cause to rethink, until he found himself arranging this camp with Murak Wildheart present and suddenly aware of how small the overhang actually was. She seemed unbothered. She checked the ledger once more by firelight, making small notes on a separate piece of paper in a tight script he could not read from his side, and then rolled the ledger carefully in an oilcloth sleeve she produced from her coat's inner pocket and tucked it in the bottom of her traveling bag with the focused care of someone putting away something alive. "You should know," she said without looking up from the bag, "that Bone will have sent a message to Harwick's people before I left that shelter." "How long ago was that?" "Last night. His messenger rode before the storm ended," Jeremiah considered. "So they know you have the ledger and you're heading for Thornwall. They will also know a man was asking questions about Bone's route before I arrived. You may be included in whatever response Harwick sends." He had thought about this. "I'm not a significant figure. I'm a trapper. You are a trapper who knew the ledger had a second notation column before I told you." He looked at her. She was watching him now, direct and still. "I didn't say I knew that. You said what's in Thornwall before I mentioned the court. You knew there was somewhere to take the evidence. You had already mapped where this was going." She tilted her head slightly. "I am not accusing you. I am observing that you are more aware of Harwick's operation than a man who avoids tax collectors usually would be." A long pause. The fire popped. Outside, a night bird called once and was silent. "My friend Declan Marsh," Jeremiah said. "I told you about him. 30 lashes for a cart in the wrong road. What I didn't say is that before that, he was the one running the legal challenge to Harwick's road toll scheme. He had been collecting testimony and payment records for a year. When they flogged him, they also took everything he had collected." He looked into the fire. "He died 3 months later, not from the lashes directly, but from an infection from the cold, from not having the means to get proper care because they'd also seized his property as road obstruction evidence. I couldn't do anything with what I knew without evidence, without a legal hook. I wasn't in the right position." He looked up at her. "You are." Murak was quiet for a long moment. "You have been waiting. I've been hoping. There's a difference." She looked at him with an expression he could not translate into any word he knew, and it sat in his chest like something warm and heavy and slightly painful in the way that warmth sometimes is when you have been cold for a very long time. "I will use Declan Marsh's name in the court filing," she said, "as a named affected party." Jeremiah looked back at the fire. "Thank you." She lay down on her bedroll, turned toward the stone wall, and was quiet. After a while he heard her breathing slow. He stayed awake a little longer, listening to the mountain and watching the fire and feeling the particular weight of having told someone something true that he had not intended to tell. The second day was harder. They were high on the ridge by mid-morning when he spotted the smoke rising from the road below, a thin, dark thread of it moving. Not a campfire, a signal fire. The kind that Harwick's road officers used when they were coordinating a search. He pulled Murak back from the ridge edge and they crouched behind a granite shelf and watched. Below, on the Pilgrim Road, there were riders. 6 of them, moving fast in the direction they'd come from. Behind the riders, barely visible through the pines, a second group moving more slowly, which meant they were searching the road edges. "They're backtracking from Thornwall direction," Jeremiah said quietly. "They think you're ahead of them on the road. Someone at the wayhouse told them you'd gone toward Thornwall." "Bessa Cordrun," Murak said, without apparent emotion. "She runs a wayhouse on a road Harwick controls. She can't afford to be unhelpful to them." He paused. "She didn't tell them about the ridge trail or we'd have company up here. She might not know about the ridge trail. She doesn't. Porter Weld never told anyone but me." Murak watched the riders. Her jaw was set and her hands were still, and she had the quality he had noticed from the beginning, not the rigidity of someone suppressing fear, but the absolute stillness of someone who had done this kind of calculation so many times it had become a reflex. She was deciding, and she was doing it fast. "We stay high," she said. "How far are we from the point where the ridge trail drops to the lower Thornwall gate?" "Day and a half at best pace. 2 if we're cautious." "We are not cautious." She stood, keeping below the ridge line. "Best pace." He stood beside her. They were close, in the way that 2 people crouching behind a rock necessarily become close, and he was aware of the height difference. She was half a head taller than him, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with mass and intention. She smelled of wood smoke and rain leather and the cold mineral smell of high altitude. He was aware of this with the specific, distinct clarity of someone who had been alone on a mountain for too long and was suddenly standing very close to someone who was both remarkable and apparently not going anywhere. He stepped back and pointed up the ridge. "This way." They moved. The afternoon of the second day gave them a narrow escape that Jeremiah felt in his sternum for hours afterward. The slower search party had apparently sent 2 riders to check the upper approaches, and those riders had more mountain sense than he had expected, and they came up a secondary trail that intersected the main ridge path at a point he knew as the crow's elbow for the shape of its rock formation. He heard the horses before he saw them, which was the only reason they were not caught. He grabbed Murak's arm and pulled her sideways into a crevice in the rock face, a space barely large enough for 1 person, and they were 2, and the closeness was immediate and total. Her back was against the rock. He was facing her, close enough to see the amber of her eyes go very still and very focused as the horses passed not 20 feet away on the trail. They stayed that way for 4 minutes by his internal count, not moving, not speaking. When the sound of the horses faded, he stepped back. There was nowhere to step to, not yet, but he created the inch of distance that was available and they both breathed. "You are a very good guide," Murak said quietly. "You are a very quiet person to share a hiding space with." She looked at him with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that suggested it was containing something else. He turned and checked the trail and moved forward without saying anything further, and she followed, and neither of them mentioned the closeness or the warmth of it or the way his heart was still running slightly faster than the terrain justified. The second night they camped in the open, under a pine overhang with no proper shelter, because the ridge did not offer anything better at that stretch. The night was cold with a damp chill that came off the stone and found every gap in a blanket, and he built the fire as large as he dared and they sat close to it. She had the ledger out again, not reading it this time but holding it, and her eyes were on the fire. He had the sense that she was thinking through the court presentation, running it the way a hunter runs a route, every step accounted for, every contingency mapped. "What happens if Castle doesn't hear it?" he asked. "I file a formal grievance record with the Provincial Archive in Thornwall regardless. It creates a documented account. It is not justice, but it is a record that cannot be easily destroyed." She turned the ledger in her hands. My grandmother says that records outlast governments. She has been saying this for 50 years, and she has been proven right 4 times. Your grandmother sounds like someone I'd like to meet. Murak's expression shifted, and for a moment something entirely unguarded moved across her face. She would like you, she said. She has opinions about useful men. He was not entirely sure what that meant, but the warmth of it sat with him. What are her criteria? She says a useful man is one who solves the problem in front of him without first checking whether solving it benefits him. She looked at him steadily. You gave me boots. They were right there. You told me about the ridge trail before you knew what I was bringing to Thornwall. You needed it, Jeremiah. She said his name plainly, without decoration, and the plainness of it was somehow more striking than elaboration would have been. I am not criticizing your modesty. I am telling you that I notice things the way you notice things, and what I have noticed since the salted stone is that you are the kind of man my grandmother was describing. He looked at her across the fire. She was watching him with the amber eyes and the directness that was. He was learning just how she operated, not aggressive, not soft, simply honest, with the confidence of someone who had decided a long time ago that honesty was more efficient than its alternatives. I'm just a trapper, he said. Declan Marsh was just a cart driver. She said it gently, not as a correction but as a completion. He was quiet for a while. The fire burned down and he fed it. She was close enough that the fire lit her from the side, and the angular line of her jaw and the small curve of her tusks and the width of her shoulders against the dark of the mountain all composed themselves into something that he found he was having some difficulty not looking at directly. You should sleep, he said. We need to be at the lower gate by tomorrow evening. I know. She did not immediately lie down. Jeremiah, when this is done, what will you do? He thought about it. Go back to the trap line, probably. Alone. That's how it's worked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she lay down, wrapped the blanket around herself, and said quietly to the dark, That seems like a waste. He sat with that for a long time after she slept. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they came down off the ridge onto the lower road 2 miles from Thornwall's south gate, and the world opened from Mountain Rock into a broad valley, with a river running through it, and the city sitting on the near bank in the flat gray light like an argument waiting to be had. Thornwall was not a large city, but it was a solid 1 stone walls, a market square large enough to hold 600 people, a civic hall with an actual tile roof, and a court building that had been there for 200 years and looked it. The streets were full for the autumn season, wagon traffic and livestock and the smoke of 100 cook fairs, and they walked into it side by side, mud-edged and ridge-worn, and no one looked twice. He found them a room at an inn near the court building, a real inn, not a wayhouse, with actual beds and actual food, and he paid for 2 rooms without making that a conversation either, which she noted and said nothing about. They had one evening before the court sat. She spread the ledger pages on the table in her room, and he sat across from her, and they worked through it together, him reading the standard entries aloud, while she cross-referenced them against her clan's own payment records and the civic tariff schedule she had committed to memory. It was the strangest evening he had spent in years, bent over ledger pages in a lamplit room with an orc woman who argued tax notation with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely loved the subject and was occasionally brilliantly right about things he hadn't seen. At some point in the middle of this, she looked up and said, You are better at this than you should be. Porter Weld used to make me read the road statutes out loud to him while he ate dinner, Jeremiah said. He said a trapper who didn't know the law was a trapper who could be robbed legally. He had a point. I think, Murak said slowly, that I would like to know more about Porter Weld. You can hear about him any time. She met his eyes. The lamp was between them, and it made her amber eyes very bright. The cut along her jaw was healing cleanly. She was so close across the small table that he could have reached across the papers and touched her face, and the thought of doing so was so clear and so specific that he had to look back down at the ledger. "Jeremiah," she said. He looked up. She leaned across the table and kissed him. It was direct, the way everything she did was direct and warm, and it tasted of the dried apple Bessa had packed and the cold of 3 days on the ridge. He kissed her back. His hand found the edge of the table and held it. She pulled back after a moment, and they looked at each other across the lamp and the papers, and there was a silence that felt like a door that had just opened onto a room neither of them had been in before, but both of them had somehow known was there. "That," Jeremiah said carefully, "complicates things." "Does it? Not a question. We have court in the morning." "We do." She did not look away. "Does it complicate the court?" "No. Then it can wait until after the court." He took a breath. "Murak." "Jeremiah." He reached across the papers and tucked a strand of her damp, dark hair behind her ear with 2 fingers, and she turned her face slightly into the touch with a naturalness that undid something in his chest that he had not known was wound tight. He said, "After the court." She smiled then, properly, for the first time since the salted stone, and it transformed her face from formidable to something that was both more and less than formidable and significantly more difficult to be rational in proximity to. "After the court," she agreed. The Thornwall Circuit Court occupied the ground floor of the Civic Hall, a long stone room with benches for the public, and a raised dais for the magistrate and a bar at the center for presenting parties. Magistrate Orvin Castle was a compact, gray-haired man who wore his judicial chain with the air of someone who had long since stopped caring what it symbolized and simply found it useful. He had a reputation, as Murak had said, for following evidence. He also had a reputation for an absolute intolerance of waste of court time, which had produced in all regular practitioners a habit of brevity that made the Thornwall Court move faster than any other circuit sitting Jeremiah had heard of. The hall was half full when they arrived. Road merchants, a few local landholders, 3 men in the blue-banded coats of provincial administration who sat in the back row, and had the carefully blank faces of people who were there to observe on behalf of someone who preferred not to appear in person. Harwick's people, Jeremiah noted, and kept his own face similarly arranged. Murak presented the writ, stated the Wildheart clan standing, and laid the ledger open on the bar. What happened in the first 20 minutes was procedural, and it was good. She was organized and precise, and the ledger entries were clear, and Castle asked questions that indicated he was following the argument and found it coherent. The 3 blue-banded men in the back shifted in their seats. Then the door of the hall opened, and a new party entered, and the room changed. Vane Harwick himself was a heavy man, 55 years, with the kind of physical authority that came not from size alone, but from the habit of occupying space as though it were his. He did not live in Thornwall, but he was here now, and he walked to the bar with 3 provincial soldiers behind him and a man Jeremiah recognized as his legal counsel, and he said, "Magistrate Castle, I am exercising my right as provincial governor to appear in any civic matter that concerns road administration in my jurisdiction." Castle looked at him. "That right is limited to matters of provincial policy. This is a matter of specific fraud allegations supported by documentary evidence. The documentary evidence was obtained illegally from a provincial officer by an Orc clanswoman who assaulted that officer and 2 of his contracted security personnel." The room went very still. Murak stood straight at the bar and said nothing. Her hands were on the ledger and she was entirely still. Jeremiah was sitting in the public benches. He had been told, very precisely, by Murak the previous evening, what to do and what not to do in this room, and the instructions included not speaking unless spoken to, and not doing anything that would give Harwick's counsel grounds to call the proceedings compromised. Castle looked at Murak. "Do you wish to respond?" "I have a writ of authorized recovery from a legally registered civic entity," Murak said. The writ was presented to the officer in question before any physical interaction occurred. The officer refused to comply and directed contracted personnel to physically prevent the execution of the writ. "I defended myself." She reached into her coat's inner pocket and produced a folded document. "I also have a second document that the governor may not know about." This was the moment. Jeremiah had not known about this second document until last night, when she had placed it on the table with the quiet satisfaction of someone laying down a hand they had held all evening. "This is a deposition from a sitting clerk of the Thornwall Provincial Archive, dated 8 days ago, confirming that I presented the pending writ to the archive for registration, and was told at that time that the ledger in question was listed as a provincial public record, not private property, under the road statutes of the founding charter." She passed it to the court clerk, who passed it to Castle. The deposition also confirms that the archive clerk attempted to retrieve the ledger through standard request procedure from Subcollector Bone 5 months ago and received no response, which makes the ledger's continued retention by a private person obstruction of civic records. The silence in the hall had a different quality now. The 3 blue-banded men were very still. Harwick's counsel leaned in and said something to him in a low voice. Castle read the deposition, read it again, and set it down. He looked at Harwick. "Governor, do you have a response to the deposition?" Harwick's face was doing the thing that powerful men's faces do when the ground has shifted, and they are still standing on what was there before. He said, "The deposition was obtained in a manner designed to prejudice this proceeding. A deposition from a sitting civil servant obtained 8 days before these proceedings began cannot be characterized as prejudicial. The timing shows preparation, not manipulation." Castle looked at the ledger. "I am going to take this into chambers for review. I am also going to request the presence of the provincial archive clerk for testimony this afternoon." He looked at Harwick with the flat clarity of a man who had stopped being impressed by governors approximately 30 years ago. "Governor, you are welcome to remain in the public gallery. You are not a party to this proceeding. My office is named in the—" "Your office is not named in the filing. A provincial subcollector is named. If you wish to be named as a party, your counsel can file the appropriate motion by the end of the morning session, and we will schedule a hearing for next week." Castle stood. "Court is in recess." The room broke into noise. Harwick turned and found Jeremiah Reed with his eyes across the hall, somehow, across the noise and the press of people, finding the one face that had not changed expression, and held it for a moment with the look of a man cataloging a threat. Jeremiah held it back and did not look away. Outside in the corridor, Murak found him, and they stood by a stone pillar while people moved around them. She was breathing carefully, with the focused release of someone discharging a very high level of tension through controlled respiration. "That was extraordinary," Jeremiah said. "It may not hold. He has 3 soldiers and a council and a provincial administration." Castle is going to read that ledger and it is going to tell him a story. Yes, she was looking at the corridor entrance where Harwick had just exited with his counsel close behind, the soldiers a step back. The problem is what happens between now and the afternoon session. He has 4 hours. What can he do in 4 hours? Pressure the archive clerk, instruct his counsel to file a blocking motion, have someone go through my traveling bag which is at the inn. She paused. "Have someone go through me." Jeremiah looked at the door. He thought about the 6 riders on the road below the ridge. He thought about the 2 men at the Miller's Fork shelter. He thought about Declan Marsh. "I have the ledger," he said. "Give me the deposition too." She looked at him. "Where will you go?" "There's a shrine to the road saints at the south end of Market Square. It's public, it's crowded, and the priests there have a long-established tradition of being unresponsive to provincial authority because the saints' order predates the province." He held out his hand. "I'll wait there with the documents until the afternoon session. You stay visible, stay in public, give them nothing to charge you with." She held the deposition for a moment. Then she placed it in his hand, along with the oilcloth sleeve from her bag that contained the ledger. Her hand stayed on the oilcloth for a moment, and his hand was under hers, and they both looked at the documents and then at each other. "Be careful," she said, and the word had weight she wasn't entirely controlling. "Always am." He pocketed the documents and walked toward the south door and the market square. The Shrine of the Road Saints was a squat stone building at the south end of the square with a permanently open door and two priests in residence who had, in 30 years of serving the road traveler community, learned to be deaf to almost everything that did not involve someone bleeding on their threshold. Jeremiah sat in the back pew with his coat over the documents and his eyes on the door, and waited with the focused patience of a man who spent large portions of his life waiting in cold, exposed locations for something to either happen or not happen. He sat there for an hour and a half before Harwick's man found him. Not a soldier. A single man, middle-aged, in traveling clothes, with the flat eyes of someone professional. He came in, sat one pew back, and said quietly, "My employer would like the documents." "Your employer doesn't have standing in this proceeding," Jeremiah said, looking at the shrine altar. "My employer has 4 soldiers in the square and a provincial warrant he can issue for your detention as a witness." "A witness to what?" "Obstruction of provincial administration." "I'm a road traveler in a public building," Jeremiah said. "I have documents from a registered civic entity that are scheduled to appear in a legal proceeding this afternoon. If they disappear between now and then, that's its own kind of story, isn't it?" A pause. "You're nothing. You're a trapper from the upper ridge." "That's right." Jeremiah looked at the man directly. "My name is Jeremiah Reed. I've worked the ridge trail above the Pilgrim Road for 10 years. I know every wayhouse keeper, every road merchant, and every shrine priest on a 200-mile stretch. If you take these documents, every one of them hears about it before dark, and the story of how Harwick's man grabbed legal evidence from a shrine in Thornwall Market Square travels faster than a provincial warrant." He kept his voice even. "I'm nothing, but I'm nothing in a very specific place at a very specific time." The man sat for a while, then he got up and left. Jeremiah sat in the shrine and let himself breathe fully for the first time in about an hour and 45 minutes. His hands were entirely steady, which surprised him slightly. He thought about Declan Marsh, who had sat in the city a year before he died with a box of evidence and no one standing at his shoulder. He thought about Murak Wildheart arriving at the wayhouse door in the storm. He thought he would very much like to get through this afternoon and find out what happened after the court. The afternoon session lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, and it was the most consequential 2 hours Jeremiah had spent in a room since his first conversation with Porter Weld. Castle had read the ledger. The archive clerk testified with the careful precision of someone who had spent 8 days preparing for exactly this moment. Murak presented the cross-reference between the ledger's second notation column and the Wildheart clan's own payment records, and she did it with a clarity that made Harwick's counsel's increasingly complicated objections seem like weather patterns being argued against mathematics. Harwick sat in the gallery for the first hour and left before the second, which was its own kind of statement. Castle issued a formal finding of fraudulent civic collection, named Subcollector Aldrich Bone as the responsible party, noted the evidence of direct financial benefit to a provincial administrative office, and referred the matter to the Capital Court's standing Civic Corruption Tribunal. He also issued a formal order returning the excess road tolls collected from Wildheart clan and all 11 other named townships over the 3-year period. He also, in a line at the end of the finding that Jeremiah read 3 times to make sure he had understood it correctly, formally noted that the ledger's preservation and the successful presentation of the case had depended on the actions of Murak Wildheart of Clan Wildheart and an unnamed road traveler, and stated for the record that interference with legal civic process through provincial military means was itself a matter now referred for investigation. Harwick was not convicted in that room. He was not arrested. He did not, that day, lose anything except the certainty that he was untouchable, which was something he would have to reckon with at the capital level in a process that would take months and possibly years. But the finding was issued, and the referral was made, and it was on the record, and Murak had been right about records. Outside the Civic Hall in the early evening, With the market square still full around them and the low autumn sun turning the stone buildings amber, Murak stood on the steps with the court copy of the finding in her hands and was, for the first time since Jeremiah had known her, simply still. Not the stillness of control or the stillness of calculation. Just still. Beside her, after a while she said, "Declan Marsh is named in the finding. I know, I heard. It does not give him back what was taken. No, but it puts his name in the record with the right context around it." He looked at the square. He would have liked that. She turned and looked at him. In the amber light she was very beautiful, and he had long since stopped pretending to himself that he was not affected by that, so he just looked back at her and let it be what it was. Jeremiah. Still here. She reached out and took his hand, which she had not done before, neither of them had, since the crow's elbow where the closeness had been necessity, and her hand was large and warm and stronger than most things he'd touched, and he held it back. "You said after the court," she said. "I did say that. The court is done." "It is." She pulled him gently by the hand off the steps and they walked into the market square in the long amber light, and he did not let go. They went back to the inn, and they ate actual food at an actual table with actual wine, which was a category of evening he had not fully appreciated until this moment. And they talked for 2 hours about nothing urgent, about Porter Weld and her grandmother and the Ridge Trail, and the 7 languages the clan road circuit had taught her, and the specific moral character of mountain foxes, which he had opinions about after 10 years of professional interaction with them. She laughed at the fox story, a real laugh, full and low and warm, and it did something to the room that he felt long after the sound had stopped. Later, when the inn was quiet and the last candles were burning low, she stood in the doorway of his room. She had found him in the corridor, and the corridor was narrow, and they were close, and the amber of her eyes was very dark in the low light, and she said, "I do not want to go back to my room." He looked at her. He had known her for 4 days, which was not long in the ordinary way, but 4 days on a mountain in a storm being chased by road soldiers, and sitting in a shrine with legal documents, and standing shoulder to shoulder in a court hall, while a governor tried to dissolve what they'd built was not ordinary in any accounting. It was, he thought, the kind of 4 days that was worth about 3 years of ordinary time. "Then don't," he said. She stepped through the doorway. He woke before dawn with the particular awareness of someone who has learned to gauge time by darkness, and she was there, and the room was warm, and there was a quality to the morning that he had not felt in years. The quality of a room that contained more than one person's breathing, more than one person's warmth, more than one set of plans forming in the gray light before sunrise. He lay still for a while and let it be real before he did anything that would make it officially a morning, and therefore a thing that had to be addressed. She was already awake. He could tell by the quality of the stillness, which was the active stillness and not the passive one. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm often thinking." "What about?" A pause. "The route back to clan territory goes through Coldgate. My horse is still at the stable in Crossbell Ford. I need to collect it." Another pause. "Your trap line is on the upper ridge above the Pilgrim Road, which is below Coldgate." He turned his head and looked at the ceiling. "It is. The clan circuit runs through Coldgate twice in a season. I know the road." "I know you know the road." She turned her head and he turned his, and they looked at each other in the gray dawn. "I am telling you that I will be on it. I'll be on the ridge above it. Then we will encounter each other, probably." She looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face had several layers, and he tried to read all of them and got most of them. The top layer said, "This is practical." The second layer said, "This is what I want." The third layer, the one beneath the composure and the calculation and the directness, said something about being alone in ways she did not often admit, and finding that this room, this gray morning, this particular man, had made a dent in that. "I like you," she said. It was the plainest possible version of something much larger, and they both knew it. "I like you," he said. Same size, same plainness. She smiled. It was the full smile, the the one that changed everything about her face, and he thought about how rare it was and how much he intended to spend the indefinite future being the specific cause of it as often as he could manage. The morning required logistics, because mornings always do. She sent a message by fast rider to the Wildheart clan's nearest road post, reporting the court finding, and requesting the conveyance of the refund enforcement through the civic mechanisms now in motion. He sorted his pack and replaced the cracked boots, because he had, it emerged, a second spare pair he had not mentioned, which made her look at him with the specific expression of someone filing a detail for future reference. They walked to the market square together in the sharp morning air, which was cold and bright and full of the ordinary noise of a city going about its business, in the comfortable ignorance of everything that had happened in the civic hall the day before. A court finding in Thornwall, a referral to the capital tribunal, the beginning of the end of Vane Harwick's uncontested grip on the Pilgrim Road. None of this showed on the face of the market square, which was just selling things and arguing about prices, and being exactly as it had always been. He thought about the way that the most significant things sometimes had no exterior. The storm that brought Murak Wildheart to the wayhouse door. The moment he had put boots on the floor without making it a conversation. The night in the lamplit room with the ledger pages between them. The door of his room in the inn. None of these had announced themselves. They had just been there, and the meaning was entirely in what you did next. They stopped at the south gate, where the road divided northeast toward Crossbell Ford, northwest toward the Ridge Trail and the upper mountain routes. "I will be in Coldgate in 12 days, Murak said. She was carrying her traveling bag and the oilcloth-wrapped copy of the court finding, and she was wearing the boots he had lent her and had apparently decided to continue wearing, which was a decision she had not mentioned and he had not questioned. "The clan will need the full report in person. It will take time. I'll be on the ridge," he said. "I'm already 2 weeks behind on the trap line." "You should not be further behind on my account." "I'm not behind on your account. I'm behind on Harwick's account." He paused. "And I'd do it the same way again." She looked at him, and the careful composure that usually framed her expressions was slightly frayed at the edges in the way it sometimes was in the gray morning in the inn room, and he thought that the fray was the truest version of her, the version underneath the capability and the directness and the formidable focus, where the real person lived. She stepped forward and kissed him in the middle of the gate road, which was public and populated, and which she either did not care about or had actively decided in favor of. He kissed her back with both hands on her face, and she made a sound low in her throat that was warm and entirely private in the middle of the public road, and the people moving through the gate around them did the thing people do in markets when someone does something personal in a public space, which is mostly to look somewhere else and keep moving. When they stopped, she pressed her forehead against his for a moment. She had to bend slightly to do it, given the height, and said quietly, 12 days. "I'll be there." She straightened, held his gaze for one more moment with the amber eyes completely open and unguarded in a way that he had not seen until the inn room and which still hit him somewhere below the sternum every time, and then she turned and walked toward the northeast road. He watched her go. He was aware that he was watching her go and not attempting to look like he wasn't, which was new. He was usually better at looking like something was ordinary than he felt about it. This he had apparently decided not to bother with. He turned and walked toward the northwest road and the ridge in the trap line, and the day was cold and clear and full of a feeling that was not precisely happiness, because it was sharper than happiness and had edges that could catch on things, but was close to it, or at least was the direction in which happiness was located, and he was moving toward it at speed. The 12 days on the trap line were productive, which was good because he needed them to be, and also slow in a way they had not been before, which was new. He had been alone on the ridge for 10 years, and had not often found it slow. The mountain had its own pace and its own demands, and if you paid attention to them, you were seldom bored and seldom lonesome in the simple sense. But there was a different quality to the 12 days that he could not pretend was not there, which was the quality of time that was between two things rather than simply itself. He thought about Murak Wildheart in the way that you think about things you are still building a language for. He knew the surface details of her, the amber eyes, the way she moved through difficult terrain, the focused intelligence she brought to a ledger page, the laugh that changed the air of a room. He did not know most things about her. He wanted to. He was aware that this wanting was not cautious or tentative but simply large, the way the mountain was large, and he had spent enough time on the mountain to be comfortable with large. He also thought about Harwick, because Harwick was not resolved. The court finding was real and the referral was real, but the man was still in his seat, still had his soldiers, and the process of stripping that kind of power from a sitting governor through civic tribunal could take a year or more and could be obstructed in ways that a court finding in a provincial town could not fully protect against. He had lived on a road that Harwick controlled long enough to know that a legal reversal and a practical reversal were not the same thing, and the gap between them was where people like Declan Marsh had come to harm. He kept his eyes open on the ridge, watched the road below, and saw nothing that alarmed him. The search riders did not come back. The signal fires did not reappear. Perhaps Harwick was contending with the capital referral. Perhaps he was simply waiting. On the 11th day, he came down from the ridge and rode to Coldgate, and took a room at the wayhouse there, which was better than the salted stone in the basic category of having walls that did not let in the wind. She arrived on the 12th day in the late afternoon, on her bay horse with its freshly shod hooves, riding up the main market street of Coldgate with the direct, unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She had washed the road off, which the ridge trail had not allowed, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and the leather of her travel bodice had been cleaned and oiled. She looked, Jeremiah thought from where he was standing outside the wayhouse, like the kind of woman who made streets briefly quieter when she moved through them, not because of menace, but because of presence. She saw him outside the door and rode to him and dismounted, and before he could say anything reasonable, she put one hand on his jaw and looked at his face with the careful attention she gave to documents she was determining the authenticity of, and apparently satisfied herself on whatever point she was checking, and said, "Good, good," he said. "You look well." She handed him her horse's reins, which he took without comment. The clan agrees to the refund enforcement timeline. "My grandmother sends her regards." "Sends her regards," he repeated. "To me. She says, tell the man with the boots that he is welcome in clan territory whenever the mountain permits." He felt warmth move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Tell her I'm honored. Tell her yourself, eventually." She looked at him with the small, particular smile. "She intends to be around for a while." He walked her horse to the stable and she walked beside him, and they were quiet for a while in the easy way that people are quiet when they have found the frequency at which silence between them is comfortable rather than waiting for something. "How much did you tell her?" he asked, leading the horse into the stable. "Everything relevant, and she sent her regards." She also said, "An orc woman who chooses a man because he is kind and useful and does not make a production of either quality is a woman who has learned something worth knowing." Then she gave me a lecture about road tolls for 45 minutes, which is how I knew she was satisfied. He hung the horse's saddle and felt the smile coming up through him before he could decide whether to let it show. He let it show. "My grandmother never gave me advice about anything. She died when I was 8 and I only met her twice. My grandmother has given me advice about everything continuously for 28 years. Did you want advice about me?" Murak turned from hanging the bridle and looked at him across the warm, dim stable with the amber eyes and the full composure that contained everything else and the small fray at its edges that he was learning to find and prize. "No," she said. "I did not need advice about you." He crossed the stable in 3 steps, and she came forward at the same moment, and they met in the middle. And she was warm and strong and real, and she put her arms around him, and held on with the particular quality of holding that is different from an embrace of greeting and different from an embrace of comfort, and is instead the holding of someone who has been somewhere else and is now back in the place they intended to be. He held her back with everything he had, and his face was in her hair, and she smelled like road and horse and the cold, clean scent of high altitude. And he thought about the lonely mountain and the trap line and the 12 days and the years before them, and felt all of that diminish in relation to this present moment, the way distance diminishes when you finally arrive. There was one more thing to deal with, and it came 3 days into the time at Coldgate in the form of a message delivered to the wayhouse by a provincial rider in Harwick's colors. Jeremiah read it at the bar while Murak stood at his shoulder, and the message said that a warrant had been issued for Murak Wildheart on charges of assault against a provincial officer and theft of provincial records, citing the events at Miller's Fork Shelter, and that she was to present herself to the provincial administration post in Westmark within 5 days for processing. He folded the message very carefully and set it on the bar. Murak was already reaching for her coat. "I will need to send an immediate communication to the clan legal." "No." He put his hand over hers on the coat. "Look at the date on this warrant." She looked. He watched her process it. The warrant was dated 2 days after the court finding. The assault charges were the same events that the court finding had already addressed as defensive action under the authorized recovery writ. Castle had been explicit about it. More than that, the issuance of a warrant on charges that a sitting magistrate had already reviewed and cleared was either a procedural blunder of monumental proportions or a deliberate attempt to circumvent the finding through a separate process. "He's panicking," Jeremiah said. "He has resources and a seat of power, and he is not done. He's issuing a warrant for conduct that Castle already cleared in writing." Jeremiah looked at the message again. "This doesn't stand up. It's designed to make you run or to make you spend the next month handling it instead of working the case. If I ignore it and go to the capital, he will say I fled a valid warrant. Then we don't ignore it." He looked at her. "We go to Westmark." She studied him. "Westmark is Harwick's territory, his administration post, his garrison. And it has a public square and a civil registry office, and the kind of crowds that turn a thing into a story." He tapped the warrant. "If he wants to process you publicly under a warrant that contradicts a sitting magistrate's finding, let him do it publicly. That is a significant risk." So was riding through a storm barefoot to take a ledger from a man with 2 hired guards. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are the opposite of cautious. I'm a trapper. I know when the bait is too obvious, and I know when the trap is yours to set." He met her eyes. "He expects you to run or to hide behind process. He doesn't expect you to walk into his square with the court finding in your hand." Murak was quiet, running it through. "Then, we go to Westmark." They left the next morning. Westmark was the kind of frontier town that looked comfortable with itself on the surface and was uncomfortable at its core. Wide Main Street, good market, stone church, 3 inns. It also had a provincial garrison on the east edge and an administrative post that functioned, in practice, as Harwick's face in the region. The people went about their business with the slightly careful quality of people who knew they were being watched and had learned to find the edges of what was permitted. They arrived at midday, which meant the market was full and the square was populated, and Jeremiah had chosen this timing with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about set pieces in public spaces, with 600 years of frontier road wisdom behind the approach. Murak walked into the square barefoot, which was not planned and was not performance. She had taken the boots off to check a stone bruise on her heel at their last rest stop and had not put them back on, and they had arrived faster than expected. Jeremiah was carrying them in his left hand. She was wearing her travel clothes, the fitted leather bodice and doeskin leggings, and the linen blouse that the road had road-tested thoroughly, and she was carrying the court finding in her right hand, and she was, in every quality of her bearing and movement, absolutely not someone who had come to this square to be processed. She went directly to the provincial administration post, which was a stone building at the far end of the square with 2 guards at its door and Harwick's provincial banner flying above it, and she stopped in front of the guards and said, in a voice sized for the square rather than a conversation, "I am Murak Wildheart of Clan Wildheart. I understand there is a warrant issued for my appearance. I am here. I also have a formal finding from Magistrate Orvin Castle of the Thornwall Circuit Court, dated prior to this warrant, addressing the specific events cited in this warrant as lawful defensive action under registered civic authority. I am asking that both documents be presented together to the issuing officer." The square had gone quiet in the specific way that public spaces go quiet when something is happening that might be consequential. People were not leaving. People were, in fact, arriving. The guards looked at each other. They looked at Murak. They looked at the paper in her hand. They looked at Jeremiah, who was standing 1 step behind her to her left, holding a pair of boots, which he thought was probably not the most authoritative image he'd ever projected, but which he was managing to maintain with reasonable composure. A man came out of the administration building. He was a deputy administrator, a younger man, nervous in the way that men are nervous when the script has not prepared them for what is actually occurring. He took the court finding from Murak and read it. He read it again. He went back inside. The square waited. Jeremiah counted 40 breaths. The deputy came back out with an older man behind him, not Harwick, but the garrison commander, a heavy man with a soldier's face that had been arranging itself around difficult orders for 20 years and had lines to show for it. The garrison commander looked at Murak. He looked at the court finding in his deputy's hand. He said, "The warrant is issued under provincial authority." Under provincial authority that the court finding indicates was exercised in response to lawful civic action, Murak said. "If you process me under this warrant, the processing will be entered as a civic record, and the court finding will be entered alongside it, and the question of whether a provincial warrant can contradict a sitting magistrate's civic finding will be a question for the capital tribunal." She tilted her head, "which is already scheduled to review the case referenced in the finding." The garrison commander was quiet. The square was very, very quiet. He said, "I am not in a position to dismiss a warrant issued by the governor. I am not asking you to dismiss it. I am asking you to process it in its full documentary context." Another silence. The commander's face was working through a calculation that Jeremiah could map perfectly. The weight of following orders against the weight of what those orders would look like when the capital tribunal finished its work, which, if Castle's referral was as strong as Jeremiah believed it to be, was going to be a weight that crushed the people who had not made the correct choice when they had the chance. The commander looked out at the square. He looked at the people who were watching. He looked at Murak, who was watching him back with perfect composure and absolute patience, and Jeremiah, who was standing beside her with the boots still in his hand. He said, "The warrant is noted as processed. No arrest is required pending the outcome of the capital referral." He looked at the deputy. "Recorded as presented with supporting documentation." He went back inside. The square breathed. Murak turned to Jeremiah with the expression that was composed on the surface and underneath, was something that he recognized as the particular relief that looks almost the same as calm if you don't know what you're looking for. He held out the boots. She sat down on the step of the administration building, right there in the square in front of everyone, and put them on. When she stood up, a woman near the front of the crowd, a wool merchant's wife, by the look of her, began to clap. It was uncertain at first, the kind of applause that isn't sure of itself, and then it was joined by others, and then it was simply the sound of a square full of people who had been watching the thin edges of their permitted lives for too long and had just seen someone push back and remain standing. Murak did not take a bow. She did not address the crowd. She found Jeremiah's eyes and held them with the amber gaze that he had been trying to accurately read since the salted stone, and failing and learning and improving. And she reached out and took his hand again in the middle of the square, in front of everyone. and held it in the large, warm grip that he had been thinking about on the ridge for 12 days. He held on. They rode out of Westmark on the road north, and the day was bright and cold, and the mountain was visible above the tree line with its first snow showing on the upper peaks. And Jeremiah felt the road under him with the quality he associated with right choices made in the right time, not triumphant, not flashy, but solid, the kind that holds under weight. Harrowing was finished. Not today, perhaps not for months, but the capital tribunal had the referral and the court finding, and now a public record of a provincial warrant that had been administratively processed and deferred under the pressure of its own contradictions. And the shape of that outcome was already determined, the way the shape of a stone arch is determined by which stone you remove. Someone in the capital administration was going to remove the right stone, because records outlast governments, and Murak Wildheart's grandmother had been right about that for 50 years. Declan Marsh's name was in the record. They stopped at the Miller's Fork shelter on the way back, which had a certain quality of symmetry that neither of them mentioned but both of them clearly felt, and built a fire in the brazier and ate the food they'd packed and sat in the shelter opening with the mountain above them and the road quiet below. Murak had taken off the borrowed boots and was looking at them. "These have become mine," she said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. "They became yours on the road from the salted stone," Jeremiah said. "You could have asked for them back any time. I thought about it once, then I didn't." She held one boot up and looked at the sole, which had the wear of the Ridge Trail and the Thornwall Streets and the Westmark Square on it. "I will need a new pair eventually. These will last the season but not the next. I know a bootmaker in Coldgate." "Of course you do. I know everyone on the road. This is a quality I find increasingly useful." She set the boot down and looked at him in the firelight, which was the same amber as her eyes, and the look had all the layers that he had been learning over the course of 8 days of mountain trails and storm roads and courthouse halls and shared bedrooms and market squares. And beneath all the layers was the one that said, "You, specifically." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and turned it over and looked at it, the width of the palm, the length of the fingers, the particular green of the skin in firelight. He had large hands for a man his size, rough from trapping work, and hers dwarfed them, and this seemed to him entirely right, everything in its correct proportion. "Stay on the road this season," he said. He had not planned to say it, which meant it came out simply, the way true things do when you stop managing them. "The circuit, the clan route, whatever it takes you, just stay on this road." She looked at him. "The upper ridge is not on the clan circuit. I can adjust the line." "You would move your trap line." "I've been meaning to extend it east anyway. There's a canyon system I've been wanting to work for 2 years. It runs along the road circuit at several points." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to change your route, I'm changing mine." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire spoke between them. The mountain stood above. "Jeremiah Reed," she said, and the way she said his name, both parts of it with the weight she gave it, was not a greeting or a summons. It was the way you say a name when you are keeping it, when you are putting it in the place where kept things go. "Murak Wildheart," he said back in the same register. She leaned forward across the small space between them and kissed him the way the first kiss in the inn room had been, direct and certain, and then pulled back just far enough to speak. "I will stay on the road," she said against his mouth. "And you will extend the line east." A pause. "And we will encounter each other." "Constantly," he agreed. She made the low, warm sound that belonged to his room in the inn and to no one else, and she kissed him again, and the fire in the brazier threw their shadow up the stone wall behind them. 2 shapes joined at the shoulders with the mountain behind them and the road below. The vow was not planned. It happened 3 weeks later, on the threshold of the salted stone wayhouse, which they had come back to because Jeremiah needed to settle an account with Bessa Cordron, and Murak was riding the circuit past it anyway, and there was no logical reason not to arrive together. Bessa was at the bar when they came in, and she looked at them with the expression of a woman who catalogued everything that passed through her door and had reached a conclusion about this particular arrival. She said nothing, which was its own kind of speech. The road was changing. Harwick's road checkpoints had gone quiet in the last 2 weeks. The garrison commander's decision in the Westmark Square had traveled faster than official communication, as those things do, and the collectors on the Pilgrim Road were reviewing their position with the careful attention of men who had noticed which way the wind had turned. The Capitol Tribunal had sent a formal request for the ledger copy. 3 other clans and 4 road townships had filed supporting declarations referencing the Wildheart case. Murak stood outside the wayhouse door in the evening light and looked up at the mountain above the ridge, which had more snow on it now than it had when they first arrived here, and Jeremiah stood beside her on the threshold. "The last time I stood at this door," she said, "I was barefoot and furious." "You were both of those things in a remarkable degree," he said. "You gave me boots. You took them without making it a conversation. I thought it might be pity. It wasn't pity. I know what it was," she said. She turned and looked at him in the fading light, and her amber eyes were warm and direct and entirely open in the way they had been since the night in the inn, the fray becoming the fabric rather than the exception. "I have been thinking about what to call it. Have you reached a conclusion? My grandmother would call it the beginning of a claim." She held his gaze. "In the old clan tradition, when an orc woman calls a place home and calls a man hers, she says it at the threshold of the first place they stood together. The salted stone was the first place we stood together." He looked at the threshold. The old stone step, worn smooth by 20 years of travelers. The door frame hung with Bessa's dried mountain herbs for the road Saint Blessing. The mountain above and the road below and the evening sky going from amber to deep blue. He turned back to her. "Say it." She stepped forward and put her hands on his face, the way she had done in the Coldgate Market Street, the careful attention, the checking, and then she said, "You are mine, Jeremiah Reed. I claim you under sky and road. I am yours, Murak Wildheart. I claim the threshold." He reached up and put his hands over hers where they rested on his face. He said, "I am yours, and you are mine, under sky and road." She kissed him on the threshold of the salted stone wayhouse, and Bessa Cordron, visible through the window with her ladle still raised from whatever she had been doing, watched it and then very deliberately turned her back and gave the fire her full attention. The mountain stood above them in the evening, wearing its first snow, and the Pilgrim Road ran below in both directions toward everywhere they had been and everywhere they were going. His trap line was on the ridge. Her route was on the road. The distance between those 2 facts had, as of this threshold, become a matter of practical logistics rather than separation, which was to say it was no distance at all. He kept his hands on hers and his forehead against hers, and felt the breathing of a woman who had arrived at a wayhouse door in a storm, furious and barefoot, with all the force of a person who had long since learned to depend on nothing but herself, and who had been learning, over the weeks since, that depending on something is different from being diminished by it, that choosing someone is different from needing to be saved, that the man who gives you boots without ceremony is the man who will stand in a square and hand you the finding and change his trap line and say your name back to you in the register that means kept. She breathed. He breathed. The evening settled around them. "Come inside," he said. "Bessa will pretend she isn't going to ask us everything. She is very obviously going to ask us everything. We'll answer half of it." She smiled, the full one, the real one, and took his hand, and they stepped inside together.